This is a tutorial on the California Residential Sales Checklist. These are all the documents that you need to submit at the end of a transaction to have a complete file. It's less than 2 full pages. We'll go through it line by line. It's fairly simple and straightforward. This is essentially the minimum of what you need to be in compliance. So we'll jump right into it. We start with the opening documents here. You'll have the listing agreement when you're the listing agent, the buyer's pre-qualification or pre-approval letter. Now that's optional, but good to have. So you'll want to include that. It should have been included in the offer unless it's a cash buyer. Now the purchase agreement, you'll notice when you log into Zip Forms, it's a bundle. There's a bunch of disclosures and advisories that are before and after the purchase agreement itself. And that's basically this bundle right here. And that's what you'll want to include. Counteroffers if they were used, addendums if they're used, the MLS sheet, signed by the seller if you're the listing agent. The reason is that when you first produce that MLS listing, you want to have the seller initial or sign off on the sheet, basically verifying that the information you put in the MLS is accurate, because sometimes there can be miscommunication. The wrong information might be entered by the agent because they don't know, or the seller told them the wrong information. And if you get blamed by the buyer in the future, the seller is very unlikely to take responsibility. So you want to be upfront, and this is a good way to just verify the information in the very beginning before anything goes wrong. Here we have receipt of initial deposit, or the EMD, earnest money deposit, from escrow. Escrow can give you a copy of that. FHA VA mandatory clause, if the buyer did get an FHA or VA loan, then they'll be able to furnish you. You'll get this in the file anyway. And there's a CAR form, FVAC, but this is only applicable when the buyer's getting an FHA or VA loan. Wire fraud advisory, it's going to be included in this bundle up here. Disclosures and reports. Now these agency relationship disclosures, they're required by law, and they're built into the listing agreement. So listing firm to seller, you'll already see this with the listing agreement bundle above. And same with this one, selling firm to buyer, that's already built into the purchase agreement. But sometimes I see agents split up the documents in the purchase agreement, and that's why it's important to have all of them. Lead disclosure, and this is if it's built prior to 1978. If not, you don't need to include it. Natural hazard disclosure report, and the statement signature page, which is the page that has the listing agent, the seller, and the buyer signing acknowledgement of the report. Now, sometimes I see seller, or I'll hear from a party in a transaction that the buyer's waived the NHD report, that's what they call this, or other disclosures. The buyer just can't waive disclosures. That's an obligation placed on the seller by the state, by law. And the seller can give that to the buyer. Now, the buyer, of course, can just throw it away or do whatever they want with it, but it's incumbent upon the seller to furnish and deliver to the buyer disclosures. This cannot be waived. Transfer disclosure statement, again required by state law. Most of this at some capacity is required by law. If not, it's very wise to have it in here, and that's why it's on this list. I've worked very hard to put together a list that keeps it minimal, because some of these checklists can just get very lengthy and overlap, but also be compliant in the case of an audit or a legal dispute. Residential earthquake hazards report signature page, if built prior to 1960. Now this form seems to annoy agents, but it's very important, because when things go wrong, it's a huge headache. The buyer actually is responsible in the scenario that the seller doesn't pay a withholding tax, if the seller is a foreign person or entity. So they're required to do a certain tax withholding, and if they don't, the buyer has to foot the bill. So it's very simple. Do a CAR form AS, make sure it's completely filled out. None of it can be skipped, or else the form's no good. And if not, do a qualified substitute, CAR form QS. This is very simple. Just do it, and you're saving yourself a ton of headache in the future, but absolutely obligatory. Seller's questionnaire, SPQ. Interestingly enough, this is not required by state law, but this is such a useful form. You should use it. Always. Water conserving plumbing fixtures and carbon monoxide, all in the same CAR form WCMD. statewide buyer and seller advisory, SBSA. If your brokerage has affiliated services, affiliated business disclosure statement. And then we have the fire hardening and defensible space advisory if the NHD shows there's a high fire risk. When in doubt, just include it anyway. If you don't know for sure, look at the form and just fill it out and send it to the buyer. HOA documents, this is only if the property is part of an HOA. Down here, add the contingency removal form to the file if one was used. Now, there's a property inspection report. So the buyer is actually obligated in the contract to furnish the seller with a copy of this, just FYI. And then there's also the termite inspection. These are both inspections. If the buyer doesn't choose to elect these inspections, then you really should have a buyer inspection waiver, BIW, included, because you want to make sure the buyer understands that they could have done the inspection, but they're waiving the right to an inspection. And then we have the request for repairs and quadruple R, seller's response, if they were used. And then we go down here. Now, if termite, what work was done, termite completion, that's why it says if applicable. Title and escrow instructions, they don't have to be signed. A copy of the preliminary title report. Home warranty plan confirmation if one was purchased in escrow. And then finally, at the very end, closing statement, obviously. Verification of property condition, Carform VP. Copy of the commission check, and if there are local disclosures, include them. And this is just a requirement by our E&O provider that when an agent has a direct relative or has ownership, there must be a home inspection done. So that's it. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.